It may not be the climate to prove God exists, but I do think there is a climate in this world to say that the claim, which we think is a false claim from scientists, that science proves that God doesn't exist. And there's people like Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking and Sam Harris and that whole group, which basically presented that God is dead, God is not real. The whole thing is some ancient, antiquated belief system which has been overthrown. A lot of Jews, a lot of kids, the internet, these things are out there in the world, and people are moved by scientists. Scientists are the great people in our society, and when they talk like this, they do influence people. And we think it behooves us to show that the science does not point in that direction. On the contrary, when you study the science and you see that it actually leads to the opposite conclusion, to the fact that God does exist.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is The Orthodox Conundrum. This is The Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. Can science be a vehicle to get closer to God? The Rambam famously answered in the affirmative. In the second of the 1,000 chapters of his Mishneh Torah, Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, chapter 2, the Rambam writes, "What is the method towards loving and fearing God? At the moment that a person investigates his wondrous and massive actions and creations and sees through them his endless and infinite wisdom, he immediately loves, praises, and extols, and desires tremendously to know the great name. In the words of David, my soul thirsts for God, the living divine. And when he thinks about these things themselves, he immediately recoils backward and is awestruck and fears, realizing that he is a small, lowly, and beclouded creature with minimal and superficial knowledge compared to God's perfect intellect. As David said, when I see your heavens, what is man that you should acknowledge him? According to these ideas, I will clarify important principles of the works of the Master of the Worlds, so that they will be an introduction to one who understands, in order to love God. As the sages said with regard to love, from this you recognize the one who spoke, and the world came into being." The Rambam then proceeds to give an introduction to the Aristotelian worldview that was presumed true in his time. While we no longer accept the Rambam's science as accurate, his principle that knowledge of the universe is a vehicle to loving and fearing God remains an essential principle. What about using science to demonstrate God's existence? The Rambam, again, was willing to use philosophical arguments for this purpose, but others recoil from the concept. Many people have no interest in examining theories such as intelligent design and creationism and find them absurd. There's a different but somewhat similar phenomenon, which Professor David Schatz calls bold concordism, where scientists attempt to demonstrate that the first chapter of Bereshit, Genesis, and modern physics are in complete agreement, as long as the words of the Torah are read in a literal, albeit non-obvious way. Some people find this inspiring and helpful, while others dismiss it altogether. My guests today, Rabbi Aaron Zimmer and Rabbi Dr. Eli Fader, propose something quite different. They use established scientific facts based on up-to-date physics, scientific facts, that is, which no one denies, and argue that the most logical conclusion from this science is that the universe was created by an intelligent designer. This has nothing to do with the argument of intelligent design from biology and is not based upon any verses in the Torah. It doesn't even deal with questions around divine providence or other aspects of Jewish belief. Instead, they argue that modern physics has offered a brand new and extremely compelling version of the argument from design, that the values of the constants are so unusual and so inherently unlikely that the most obvious conclusion by far is that these constants were designed so that our complex universe, which includes atoms, molecules, stars, galaxies, and life, would come into existence. As they explain, almost all serious physicists were and are bothered by the problem of why the constants are what they are. Physicists almost universally acknowledge that the reason that the constants have the values that they do remains a huge mystery. Ellie and Aaron only differ with most other physicists in that many others try to solve this mystery by positing the existence of a multiverse, that is, infinitely many worlds, each with different values of the constants. Whereas my guests argue that a multiverse is far more unlikely than the obvious answer, that something with intelligence chose these constants for a reason. Regardless of whether you like the idea of using science to demonstrate God's existence or disagree with the enterprise, Ellie and Aaron's argument demands serious attention. I'm pleased to present it today, and I look forward to hearing what you think. We'll get to our conversation in a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2025, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com, and let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Rabbi Dr. Eli Fader received Yora Yora and Yadin Yadin Smichos from his Rebbe, Rabbi Yisrael Chait. He also received a PhD in mathematics from CUNY Graduate Center. Eli has been a Magid Shir at Yeshiva B'nai Torah and a mathematics professor at Kingsborough Community College since 2004. He's written the books Gematria Refigured and Happiness in the Face of Adversity, and is co-host of the podcast Physics to God and host of the podcast Simply Deep. Additionally, Eli has published many papers and delivered many talks in graph theory, his field of mathematics research. Rabbi Aaron Zimmer, co-host of the Physics to God podcast, earned a physics degree and received rabbinical ordination from Rabbi Yisrael Chait. Aaron then utilized his personal resources to venture into commodities futures trading, such as oil, natural gas, cotton, sugar, and coffee. His strategic approach was deeply rooted in the conceptual frameworks of physics and the Brisker method for Talmudic analysis. After an 11-year career, Aaron retired and now channels his intellectual energy into studying various branches of knowledge, including the Talmud and physics. Rabbi Aaron Zimmer and Rabbi Dr. Eli Fader, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Our pleasure to be here, Scott.
Thank you, Scott. Nice to see you.
We're going to be speaking about physics to God, and full disclosure, I produce your podcast, Physics to God. We're going to talk about the argument that you make a bit later in the podcast. But first, I'd like to know the basic idea in a few sentences of what Physics to God is trying to advance.
Okay, so the basic idea is that discoveries in modern physics, which something called fine-tuning, we'll talk about later, but there has been discoveries over the past few decades of something called fine-tuning, and fine-tuning provides a compelling argument for the existence of God. And in Physics to God, we introduce people who may or may not know science, may or may not know physics, and we slowly introduce the idea of fine-tuning, constants of nature, fundamentals of the universe, and show how fine-tuning leads us on a path to show in a compelling way that God exists based upon modern science.
Okay, we're going to get into what you mean by fine-tuning and some of your ideas soon, but I want to make a preliminary point. I'm sure there's some people listening right now, and they assume that you're advocating something like intelligent design, or in a more purely Jewish sense, something which is called by Professor David Schatz bold concordism, where physicists like Gerald Schroeder and Nathan Aviezer demonstrate that the first parak of Breshit, Genesis, is scientifically accurate. Now, I'm not asking you to comment on whether you agree with that or disagree with that, but there are a lot of people who don't like that stuff. And what you're doing, I know, is quite different. Could you explain how this is not that?
Taking each one separately. The first thing in terms of reconciling science with the Torah, pshat in the Torah, things like that, I guess would be called apologetics. So we don't do that at all. Our podcast is not based on verses in the Torah. It's not really based on any specific thing to Judaism. It's made for everybody, any human being. And it's really about God and an intelligent cause for the universe and science, and really has nothing to do with religion, other than, of course, God being the foundation of all religion. So it's not dealing with how to reconcile the Torah with facts of science. And the second thing with intelligent design, that term is usually referred to an argument in biology, trying to prove God from the design of biological creatures or DNA, things like that, of that nature. And it often involves arguing with scientists about biology itself. And the discussion is the theory of evolution a good biological theory or not? And, it's what we do is we are doing something completely different. We are not arguing with physicists about physics. We accept which is what's so amazing about this, why we think it's such an amazing argument, is that everybody in a certain sense accepts the science, accepts the physics, accepts that fine-tuning is a real thing. And the only disagreement between us and atheist scientists is what is the proper philosophical interpretation of it. And obviously we think it points to God, and they think it points to a multiverse, which maybe we'll talk about that also. And that's a huge difference. We're not arguing science with scientists. We're arguing what is the proper philosophical interpretation to make of the accepted science.
To clarify also for some listeners, this would mean, in other words, that if somebody is a God-believing but not Torah-believing person, let's say they're not Jewish or they're not an Orthodox Jew, this argument would hold just as much water as it would for an Orthodox Jew.
Right. Exactly.
It doesn't require believing in a certain text, in other words.
No, correct. And just one other point is just the difference between the intelligent design argument from biology and our argument, which represents from physics, from fine-tuning, is we do think there's a very strong superiority of the arguments from physics as opposed to biology. Besides, Aaron's mentioning is that we're not arguing with scientists as opposed to the people of intelligent design argument in biology argues with biologists. There's another idea is that biology is trying to say, how do you explain life on Earth? And the argument goes, there's no way to explain it other than God. Or something, some obviously it's more elaborate.
That's what intelligent design advocates say.
Exactly, that's what they say. But the idea is like biology is like a later, biology emerges, if you will, from chemistry, which emerges from physics. And the question is, how did life emerge? And there's many, many, many years which life could have somehow emerged. And they're trying to say, there's no way that could have happened, could have naturally come about other than by God, a directed process or something of that sort. And one could argue the merits or dismerits of that argument, of that position. But physics is physics is the core, the bottom baseline of our universe. The laws of physics, as we know them, gravity, quantum mechanics exhibit this thing called fine-tuning, and the very baseline of our universe points to the existence of God. And it's not really reasonable to say, oh, well, they've evolved. As far as we know, these are the unchanging laws of our universe, and these unchanging laws of our universe point to the existence of God. Now, the only way to get around that is to say, oh, well, our universe, everything which we know is really one of infinitely many other universes, something called the multiverse. But that's a totally different idea. We're dealing with the basic foundations of our universe point to God, as opposed to saying some emergent phenomenon in life points to God. Well, maybe there are fossils, maybe there's other planets, maybe there's other stuff. This is, as far as science knows, the universe, the totality of everything which exists, everything physical which exists. And we're saying this points to the existence of God. So
in other words, this science, what you're studying now, is not a subset of something else. It is the most foundational principle that we have.
Exactly. And that foundation points to the existence of God. And therefore, we think it's much stronger, much more compelling than the arguments from biology.
Okay, let me ask you, how did this project begin? Because here you are, two rabbis. And yes, Ellie, you have a PhD in mathematics. Aaron, you have a degree in physics. Still, you teach in yeshivot. How did you decide to do this particular project?
So it really started years ago, maybe over 15 years ago. I read this book by Lee Smolin, which talks about these constants and how they change. And if they're a little bit different, you're not going to have atoms and stars and molecules. And I realized like there's this incredible argument for God. And he was saying in this book, he had his theory about black holes and universes being born in black holes. And it just, with fine-tuning argument, it came across to me as like something very different than the argument of intelligent design from biology. Exactly. I had that problem for me. Evolution is a scientific theory.
Just let me interrupt for 1 second. Lee Smolin is a physicist. He's a top physicist and he's an atheist. And he also presents this idea of fine-tuning, but does not come to the conclusion of the existence of God. So Aaron is reading a book where he describes this problem of fine-tuning. And then Aaron says, hey, maybe Lee Smolin isn't saying God from this, but this is where it's pointed.
Right, exactly. Think so. Yes. I need Ellie to interpret a little bit. So I saw this argument. I gave it over to a few people. But ultimately, it's like very hard to convince somebody, hey, here's a real argument for God. There's so much skepticism. Why aren't physicists saying this? It's very hard to convince even Jews who believe in the Torah that you're going to really have a clear, compelling argument for God from physics if the scientists themselves aren't saying it. And, what can you really do? And then it was a few years later where I came across a book by Martin Rees, physicist Martin Rees, where he was, same thing, just six numbers or something. That's the name of the book. And his last chapter was, well, how do you explain all this? And his answer was the multiverse. that there's an infinite number of other universes where everything possible happens, and the constants, these numbers are different everywhere, and that explains fine-tuning. And I looked into this and just realized, like, these scientists are saying the multiverse. And it's just, it strikes a person, and even just a regular person who's not really, educated that thoroughly in physics and science, that there's something absurd and ridiculous about the multiverse. That if scientists have to say the multiverse to explain this, anybody can see there's something here, and it's worth investigating, that maybe there really is a compelling argument for God. And that's when we started writing a book. The book we started writing about 13 years ago. It took us about over 10 years to write the book. We never published it. It just was too dense. And eventually we decided to, we got to find somebody who knows how to produce podcasts, somebody great who knows how to produce podcasts. And we just wanted to turn into a podcast in order to make it lighter and make it more attainable to somebody who just doesn't have access to the science and the physics. And that's the rest of that story, Scott.
Okay, great. Highly recommended. Good production. I agree.
Right, but the main point, just to pick up on this, the main point is that we think people are scared. And my day job is I'm a community college, a math professor, and I teach math to students who have a hard time understanding complex topics. And the idea is that physics or math is often scary to people. And we try to do we try hard in the podcast to break down, to explain these topics, which might be hard in its most basic, simple components. To take Aaron is more rigorous about the physics, and then I try to give analogies and try to present to a layman the argument to show how it's compelling, how there's a compelling case to be made from modern physics to God, and that's kind of where we're at.
So we're going to get to the specific argument in a little bit, and then I still have to ask you the question, so it's coming up. How do you justify the fact that some great physicists, most great physicists, don't accept what you're saying? Meaning you claim that physicists all agree with the science that you present. However, you disagree strongly with many physicists in terms of the philosophical conclusions that this science leads to. The argument from authority, so to speak. But before we get there, I want to ask a more preliminary question. Before we even get to explaining what you mean by fine-tuning, etc., I want to ask, why do this at all? And I'll explain what I mean. It obviously is a noble thing. It's a noble effort to prove that God exists. But in some ways, people in the 21st century would say that's passé. Kant was the one who argued that all proofs for God's existence derive from the ontological proof, and he said the ontological proof doesn't really work based on his understanding, his theory of knowledge. So given that, proofs for God are now not really accepted as authentic proofs. And Rav Soloveitchik said that too in his book, Uvigashtem Misham. He said that attempts to prove God's existence are by definition futile. They're still important, he says, but as an expression of the experience of God, the longing for God. But trying to prove God's existence is just something that doesn't really work given the philosophical climate. Now, no one's forcing you to agree with Kant or Rav Soloveitchik, and I mean that seriously. At the same time, I'd like to know how you deal with this issue. If they say God can't be proved, how do you do what you're doing?
So one thing is just, I'll take that question, but just take a little bit of the edge off of it. Is that to say, when you say to prove God, people often have in mind like this absolute mathematical proof where it's just you show it to somebody step by step by step and they're compelled and they have to follow it. It's completely 100% logical necessity. So that we're not doing that. Yeah, that doesn't exist. That would be maybe something like the ontological proof might be something of that nature. And we agree that doesn't exist. What we're doing is it's an argument from design. Fine-tuning is a type of argument from design. And we think it's more than just like, a argument. We think it's a convincing, compelling argument that a reasonable person who understands it will be convinced that God exists. But again, it's not an absolute proof. And I think most of the time when people mean prove God, they're willing to accept that standard that you will be convinced if you understand it fully that God does exist. And that is what we mean. In terms of the fact of Rav Soloveitchik and Kant, so I know you're talking about that footnote in the back of Ubikashta Misham. And he references Kant, but Kant himself says, I believe, that the argument from design has to be treated with the utmost respect. And Kant says that it could show you that there is an architect for the universe, but it can't show you creation from nothing, and it certainly can't show you divine providence or prophecy or nevuah or the Torah, things of that nature. But Kant himself does think it could show you that God is the architect of the universe. And what we're trying to do is we're really trying to start slow. The world as a whole has this mistaken belief that science shows God doesn't exist. God is not real. God is just a fantasy. of religious people's imagination. And we think that the first place to start is the foundation of reality, that there is one God who intelligently causes the universe. And that's a big deal. That's a big step to get people to accept that, to see that you have convincing argument from science that there is an intelligent cause of the universe. Now, it's true we don't prove divine providence. We're not arguing for any religion at this point. It's after you accept this, then we could talk. It's much easier to prove or argue that the Torah is true once you know that God exists. It's much more difficult to convince somebody who doesn't believe in God that the Torah is true. So we're really limiting ourselves to what the design argument gives you. And I think the Rav Soloveitchik was looking, when he making those statements, I don't know, I'm not an expert in the Rav, I'm not an expert in Kant, but I think Rav Soloveitchik was looking for was the idea of a personal God, a religious encounter with God. And it's much more than what we're offering here. We're not giving that. You're not going to get that. The idea of God that you're going to get is an intelligent cause who designed the universe. The universe is not this meaningless materialistic place. It's a significant thing that we're proving, we're arguing for, but it's not what Rav Soloveitchik was ultimately looking for. And that's, I think, what you have to interpret the Rav is what he was looking for. This can't give you, but it's the place to start. It's the place to start is from science, showing that God exists, from a basic idea of physics.
Just to add one point is that even though nowadays it may not be the climate to prove God exists, but I do think there is a climate in this world to say that the claim, which we think is a false claim from scientists, that science proves that God doesn't exist. And there's people like Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking and Sam Harris and that whole group, which basically presented that God is dead, God is not real, the whole thing is some ancient, antiquated belief system which has been overthrown. And we think that's a threat. And a lot of Jews, a lot of kids, the internet, these things are out there in the world, and people are moved by scientists. Scientists are the great people in our society. And when they talk like this, Neil deGrasse Tyson is another one, when they talk like this, they do influence people. And we think it behooves us to show that the science does not point in that direction. On the contrary, when you study the science and you see that it actually leads to the opposite conclusion, to the fact that God does exist. So I think it's just to say that we're not involved in this. Well, they are doing that, and they're saying science shows the opposite. I think it's the fact is that science does point in this direction, and that's valuable to bring to people's attention.
I agree. And if I could just add a little bit to what you're saying, I don't know if you'll agree, but to me, it sounds like you're saying in terms of which God you're talking about. You're not talking about the God of Avraham Avinu, who's involved in the world and who was brought down to this world by our ancestors, but perhaps the pre-Avraham God of many people who believed in one God, according to the Rambam, for the first couple of generations of humanity. But his involvement in the universe was not something which they really considered so much, at least as the Rambam understands it. So you're talking about God at that stage, not the Abrahamic Am Yisrael type of God that we're used to in our tefillah.
Sort of. I see. I would just say I don't think that it's two separate gods, obviously.
No, obviously, I'm not saying one precludes the other.
I know that. I know
one
that.
is primary.
But,
right.
but I'm saying is you just have to, when you're dealing in areas of science and metaphysics, you have to be able to go in order. You have to know what is the foundation. First, can you establish the foundation? The Rambam, when he's establishing in his first mitzvah, he first establishes the fact that God exists. He has the Aristotelian proof of the spheres are turning and there's what's moving them. That doesn't prove for you hashgacha pratis. It's an Aristotelian proof. There's no divine providence from that. That's the first mitzvah. Once you have that, then later on in the seventh parak, he has prophecy. So you just have to build. Knowledge builds upon itself. And if you try to prove everything all at once, you'll end up with nothing. So if you just go step by step, let's start with the foundation. Once we have the foundation, then you want to discuss, how do you know about prophecy? How does Avraham show hashgacha pratis and things like that? That's a difference. You know what I mean? It just, you can't try to jump the logical steps of an argument.
I also want to add another point is that there are people, many people have various ways to come to the knowledge of the existence of God outside of a scientific argument. And we're not claiming that this is the only way for a person to accept God. You can accept God based on authority, based on your experience, based on a whole wealth of different approaches. And we're not trying to discount any of those approaches. We're just saying that there are some people who are moved by science and who are looking for something rigorous and compelling in the area of science. And this argument talks to them. And we think this argument could take even if you accept the idea of God based upon other sources, you could see firsthand through the modern scientific discoveries that God exists. And if the argument talks to you and you hear this argument, we think it's compelling. But if it doesn't compel you, or if a person thinks this doesn't really convince them, then all the other sources of why a person is attached to God is not affected by that. So this is just we're adding this on, meaning there's a value. Like there's, for example, there's a Rashi on in Shemos. The pasuk says that now you saw that from the heavens I spoke to you. And Rashi says, what do you mean you saw? Well, who cares that you saw? So he says that when there's a difference between something which a person sees for himself or something which he hears from others. He says, because when a person hears it from others, then his heart is like chalok melahamin. There's like doubts, he has questions. And when you see it for yourself, Hashem is saying, you saw for yourself that God spoke to us from heavens. And the point is that there's a difference when you accept something from authority versus when you see it on your own. And it doesn't mean without seeing it on your own, it's worthless. Of course, we accept a lot of things based on secondhand knowledge. But the degree to which we could make something firsthand and we could see the argument for ourselves, that moves us. It gives us a stronger commitment to it. And moments of nisyonos, it could ground us firmer in our relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a way that you may not have with purely based upon a secondhand type of knowledge.
Okay, then in that case, Ellie, you before mentioned that there are people who develop doubts because of people like Richard Dawkins, Stephen Hawking, and others who deny the existence of God. What about somebody who does not have doubts? Let's say, for example, somebody is perfectly comfortable in his or her belief. For that person, do you think there's value in learning proofs of the type that you're offering, or perhaps I should say demonstrations, indications, arguments of the type that you're offering? Is it only for someone who currently has doubts and is looking for a reason to believe? Or is there a benefit for people who are full ma'aminim? They believe in God and they're curious about this as well. Do you think there's a certain benefit to learning this kind of science and this kind of way of thinking about God?
There's definitely multiple benefits. So one is what Ellie mentioned before, is you have to know how to respond to people. The Mishneh Pirkei Avos says, Da malahashiv lapikoris. And there's a mitzvah to understand when the other nations of the world, when they attack you and say that your religion is stupid, your God is a fantasy, it's imaginary. And they say, science shows that God doesn't exist. It's a unnecessary hypothesis. That's the famous, quote from Laplace. So it's a mitzvah to know how to respond to them. And it's a mitzvah not just to be able to answer the other nations, but you might believe, but you have kids and your kids grow up, unless they're completely and totally sheltered, they grow up and they encounter the secular world, they encounter secular knowledge. They probably people listening to this podcast, they have the internet, and they're going to encounter a kfira. And you need to know how to answer your kids' questions, whether you're a teacher or whether you're just a parent. And you have to be able to respond to these things. That's just on a purely defensive level. But then in terms of a positive level is there's taking secondhand knowledge, just accepting God based upon authority, turning into firsthand knowledge, where you truly appreciate God, you see it for yourself, you're convinced, not just because I trust the Masorah, which is, of course, you trust the Masorah, and we're Jewish, we have a tradition that we accept, but you could see it firsthand yourself. That changes the way the idea exists for you. You relate to an idea differently when you see it yourself as true based upon your own thought process. It transforms it and has the ability to affect your soul in a different way.
The third point is that, like the Rambam talks about, for example, his first mitzvah is knowing that God exists. But then in the next, that's in Parak Aleph of Yesodei HaTorah. But then he talks about the mitzvah of Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem. And he says, how do we love God? How do we fear God? And Chazal say it's based upon knowledge. Chazal says based on through studying Torah, and the Rambam elaborates that when you see God's wisdom, whether it be in the universe, the wisdom which is implanted in the universe, or it's the wisdom in the Torah, and Sefer Mitzvot, he introduces the idea of the wisdom of the Torah, but the knowledge of the wisdom implanted in the universe really allows a person to be drawn, to appreciate, to be amazed by the great wisdom and the source. It draws the soul, the personality of the person to be able to seek out God. And it does, when you see it and you see the wisdom which he implanted, and this argument of fine-tuning, which we'll get to, it shows you the unbelievable wisdom, how God designed, fine-tuned, ordered the universe in a way which really illustrates the great wisdom implanted in the universe and draws you to that, and it humbles the person and gives them a sense of yira before the great wisdom which is exhibited by the knowledge.
That's very, very important. Let me throw out an objection your way, because you mentioned before the Rambam and his proof from the spheres. And today we look at Aristotelian proofs that the Rambam quotes, and they don't mean anything to us. In fact, to a certain degree, some people even have problems saying, hey, how could the Rambam say something which is, according to modern scientific understanding, simply incorrect, his understanding? So isn't that a fear for you now also? Right now, we think that the cutting edge physics that we have is the answer, the reality. But for all we know, next week, someone might discover something which completely undermines everything that you're saying. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. I don't mean that. But isn't there a fear that future discoveries will make your current arguments look completely irrelevant or even silly?
So no, I don't have a fear, but we do have a healthy recognition of the fact that it's possible that science will change and the framework of physics that we believe to be true now will be superseded by something else. But that shouldn't stop you from engaging in the knowledge of your times and understanding, is understanding what does the framework of truth and reality as we know it now, based upon our science, show us. Does it show us that God exists, or does it show us that God doesn't exist? He's unnecessary. And, we like the analogy of like medicine. It's like, medicine is constantly changing, and a person, when you take care of an illness, you're limited to the medicine that's available in your times. And nobody's going to say to you, don't do this medical thing because, doctors 1,000 years ago were saying you should do bloodletting, and that was really bad. So maybe you shouldn't listen to doctors nowadays. Don't do anything like that. They could be harmful. So don't do any medicine. And you don't do any medicine, you're going to die from a lot of things. And all you have available to you is the modern medicine. And everybody, I should say everybody, most rational people use the medicines available, modern medicine, in order to help their body, and they work within that framework, even though it might be superseded. And your soul and your mind should be no different. You can't just say, you can't be skeptical and throw out all knowledge derived from modern science because maybe one day it'll be superseded. This is what's available. This is what your framework of reality has to be based upon. You really have nowhere else to go. And this is other than denying knowledge through a real extreme form of skepticism, this is, we say, God exists given our knowledge at the moment.
And people do consider, like in the world, science is like the gold standard of knowledge. And we're showing how this knowledge, the modern scientific, I don't think people have doubts about, like, yes, there's always scientific revolutions, but people think about science and medicine as being solid, and they live based upon it. And we're saying is this framework of science leads towards the existence of God. And if the whole thing changes, again, we're not saying we will accept God for this reason and this reason alone. Even if it does happen, we're not saying now give up God, because there's other routes that a person has to God.
We're going to get to the argument in a minute. I'm still going to jump the gun, and you, who are the experts, and I'm not, can tell me we can't talk about that yet. But I'd like to just throw one thing out, because I think it's important, and I'm guessing that some people are already thinking in this direction. There's something out there called God of the gaps, which is, I can't explain something, so therefore I'll assume God did it. And that's called God of the gaps, which is considered philosophically unrigorous, not a good idea. And I want to say, you very clearly state this is not a God of the gaps argument. So before we even get into what you do say, can you just explain that concept? Because I think it's key.
Okay, so we have three reasons why this is not God of the gaps reasoning. Okay, so the first one is that, see, God of the gaps is basically when a person says, I don't understand something, and since I don't understand it, therefore God. That's God. That's fallacious. That's just an argument from ignorance. But this is not an argument from ignorance. This is an argument from knowledge. This is, as we'll get to, it's based upon the discoveries of modern science. There have been discovered these constants that they're fine-tuned, which we have to get to what that means. And we're presenting an argument that the cutting-edge discoveries of modern physics points to the existence of a fine-tuner of an intelligent cause. So it's not just saying, I don't understand something, so I might as well just fill it up by saying God. This is actually an argument based upon knowledge. The second point is that there's a difference between gaps and foundations. The idea is, like, imagine if you had like a theory of evolution, which explained everything about life and the emergence of life. But there's one thing, there's like the spots on a butterfly that you couldn't explain, or eyes, or whatever, something you can't explain. But it's a perfectly well worked out theory. And there's like one gap somewhere in the middle. And you say, that gap, that's God. That would be a God of the gaps. There's nothing, arguably you have a good theory, and there's just one little hole in it, and further knowledge will likely fill in that gap. But here, it's not a gap in a well-worked out theory. We're getting down to the core, the foundations of our entire universe are the laws of physics and the constants of nature. And these foundations point to the existence of God. So it's not like we have a theory with a small gap. The foundations themselves exhibit these signs or indications of God. And lastly, the problem with God of the gaps, one of the problems with God of the gaps is that no matter what you would observe, you could just say, oh, God did it. And that's why it's God of the gaps thinking. It's like anything. You just say, well, how do you explain that? Oh, God did it. How do you explain that? God did it. But this argument that's not the case here. We're showing the reason why this points to God is because we see the wisdom. We see the idea of the fine tuning. We see the design. If the universe looked like chaos and nonsense and like multiverse scientists think is the case, then it wouldn't point to God, and God wouldn't be an explanation. So we're saying is the particular form of the universe which we observe, the knowledge which we have, the way the universe presents itself and the way we observe from the best of our knowledge specifically points to God. And it's not just an argument we can just always just say, I don't understand something, it's God. There's the specific wisdom of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe is pointing to God and not any other form of the universe.
That's great. And I appreciate that preliminary whetting of our appetite. So now let's get into the argument. You keep mentioning the multiverse, which we don't know what it is. You keep mentioning fine-tuning. We don't know what that is. I know we're asking you to summarize a huge amount of research and a very long podcast series in a short amount of time. Nevertheless, I'm going to do it. Could you talk about what you mean by this term fine-tuning? And let's get into what you actually say. What is this demonstration of an intelligent cause?
Okay, so before we talk about fine-tuning, Scott, okay, no, for real. The biggest difference between how we present the argument and how Christian scholars present it, and this is really our contribution to the whole argument, is that we don't start with fine-tuning. Fine-tuning is really not the problem, it's the solution. Okay, it's a huge conceptual difference. We tie that to, how we learn Gemara, how you have that conceptual difference, but hopefully the listeners here will appreciate this point. You have to start.
So you're being Briskers in physics right
Briskers, right? Brisker physics. That's what's going on. You got to define what you mean here. Okay, this is the key. Let's start first. What are the constants of nature? Okay, so the constants of nature are that in physics and the laws of nature, there are qualities and quantities. So, for example, in gravity, there's a qualitative law that masses attract. But how much do they attract? How strong is that attraction? Or there are things called fundamental particles. They're the basic building blocks of nature, which make up, let's say, atoms. So one of those building blocks is an electron. It can't be broken down into anything else. That's why it's called fundamental. But it has certain properties like its mass. How heavy is it? So that's a quantity. It's called a constant, one of the constants of nature, and determines how heavy an electron is. And there are about 25 or so of these numbers. And the question is, how do you explain these numbers? And scientists are they're always trying to explain everything. You see the diverse phenomena in the world, all the different particles, the different observations we have, and you're trying to simplify and explain all these things through simpler and simpler laws and explanations. And they're looking for something called ultimately a theory of everything. And they have these 25 numbers, besides for the qualitative laws of general relativity and quantum mechanics. You have these 25 numbers, constants, and the problem is, how do you explain them? And Richard Feynman called this problem, nothing to do with fine-tuning. It was in the 1980s. He called this one of the greatest mysteries in physics. And it's really the most abstract point of the argument. And it's what a lot of people don't realize is the basis of the fine-tuning argument. It has nothing to do with fine-tuning. And it's how do you explain these constants? And Ellie, why don't you try to explain the mystery?
Okay, so the mystery, which again, Feynman's calling one of the greatest mysteries of physics, is that
Nobel Prize winning physicist Richard Feynman.
Yes.
Yeah, one of the greatest physicists of all time, right?
Right. And he's basically saying is that science explains all our observations based upon laws. And then those laws are based upon simpler laws, and those based on simpler laws. And that's the goal of science. I think Einstein said it's to take the complex phenomenon and reduce them to simpler and simpler components. That's the goal of science. That's what science does. And science has been very successful at getting down simpler and simpler and simpler. But then when you get down to the basis of our universe, you end up with these two beautiful sets of laws of general relativity, quantum mechanics, and these 25 numbers. And these numbers are these ugly numbers, like 1/137.0359999135, something like that. Or another number, 3 times 10 to the negative 120th power, 0.0000000, 119 zeros and a 3. You got these numbers which are at the core.
And a 3.
And a 3.
And a 3. They're not pretty numbers.
Exactly. They're very, very specific numbers. These are numbers that we have no idea what's the cause of these numbers? We measure them every single time we measure an electron, it always ends up the exact same mass. Every time we measure the charge, it always is the same. We don't know what is the cause of these values. Now, physicists, and this is Feynman's mystery, you don't want to just say that the basic building blocks of our universe are these two beautiful laws and 25 ugly, arbitrary, lengthy numbers. That's something which offends their sensibility. There's a beauty to the laws of nature. It shouldn't look like a list of data. And Feynman's saying, how do we explain that? We don't want to just posit this is the be-all and end-all. You could just posit everything as the be-all and end-all. But science, the progress of science is you get simpler and simpler and simpler.
Let me just add one thing. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I just want to make sure that to listeners this is clear, because I've heard your podcast. This is not Torah Jews saying these numbers should be beautiful. Physicists say these numbers should be beautiful. It's not that we are offended as artists. No, physicists believe these numbers have to make some sense and should be beautiful and easy to understand in that sense.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, Steven Weinberg, another Nobel Prize winner, we have a quote from there on the podcast that this is something that offends. It shouldn't just be this ugly, arbitrary list of data. That's not what physicists anticipate should be at the basis of all reality. Everything we know about reality is it becomes simple and beautiful and symmetrical, and these 25 arbitrary complex numbers don't seem to resonate with the intuition of physicists, of the basic brute facts of reality. Now, that's not to say it's logically impossible. It's certainly a possibility, but it's just like we're just explaining here. We're not making an argument from God at this point. It's just explaining why does Richard Feynman, and why does he call it a great mystery? Just say these are the numbers. They are the way they are. Because that's 25. That's a date. That's a list of data. That's not what you anticipate to be at the basis of reality.
Just to add, is like as far as the laws of physics go, the laws would be the exact same laws if you change the number from 1 over 137 to 1 over 136, or 1 over or a million. The laws of nature, and that's part of the problem, is the laws are these beautiful laws, but you just got insert these inputs which you can't explain. And again, scientists want to explain it. Now, again, other than just positing there are these brute facts, these laws, these constants, which no physicist wanted to say, there's another possibility, is to say maybe we'll discover a law which will pop out this number, 1 over 137. And for decades, physicists have been trying to do that. Feynman is referring to this, is that they've been trying, and they always think they have some way to explain it. And then when they measure this number, they realize another decimal spot, it doesn't work out. And the idea is there is this quest to maybe find some way, maybe you'll show how it results from pi or from e or some mathematics. Somehow the numbers would pop out of some qualitative laws. But try as they did, they were unable to show how do these numbers come about? Where do they come from? And Feynman said all physicists should put this number up on their wall. And the idea is that this is a mystery. Again, nothing to do with fine-tuning. They don't know anything about fine-tuning. It's a mystery. He calls it one of the greatest mysteries of physics. How do you explain the emergence of these specific numbers?
Now, just based on the God of the gaps point you mentioned earlier, now, if somebody were just to say, well, I'll tell you where these numbers come from, Mr. Feynman, because God's the one who set them that way. God chose these 25 numbers, and he made these 25 numbers. So no question, I've answered your mystery, Richard Feynman. God did it. That's called God of the gaps, okay? Because all you have is ignorance. You just have a mystery. You have 25 numbers which you can't explain. So to say that God did that is you're just filling a gap in your knowledge. It's true, it's at the foundations, a little bit better than just a gap, but it's just ignorance. You're ignorant of the solution. You have no way to explain it. It doesn't seem like they're fundamental, that they're absolute brute facts of reality. On the other hand, it doesn't seem plausible that you're going to derive all 25 of these numbers for some qualitative law. And now you have a problem, you have a mystery. To say that God did it is just an argument from ignorance. It's God of the gaps. There's no justification at this point in the 1980s to say that God did it. No argument from God at this point.
Okay. So now let's take the argument further. So we have these 25 or so numbers, which are very not pretty. They're ugly. They don't seem to make any sense, along with relativity and quantum mechanics, which are beautiful. Now what do I do with that information?
Okay, so the solution came when, as you know, in the late 1980s and later really culminated in 1998 with the discovery of fine-tuning of the cosmological constant. But as ultimately physicists realized that these numbers are not arbitrary random numbers. They might look like that, but when you realize is that if these numbers were a little bit different, yes, the fundamental laws of physics would be exactly the same. An electron would be a little bit bigger, but if electron was a little bit bigger, there wouldn't be any stable atoms. Electrons would combine with protons to turn everything into neutrons. You don't get atoms. or if the cosmological constant was a little bit bigger or smaller, that was the number Ellie was referring to. It's this insanely small number. Then the universe would have expanded way too quickly for galaxies to form. If it was a little bit smaller, the universe would have collapsed right after the Big Bang, and you wouldn't have any universe at all. And so for a bunch of these numbers. And what that really showed you is that the numbers are not arbitrary numbers, but they are specific numbers that are needed in order to produce a universe that's complex and ordered and structured, that has atoms, molecules, planets, stars, galaxies, and life. And if the numbers were any different, you wouldn't have molecules, you wouldn't have planets. So what fine-tuning does is it solves the mystery. It points you in the direction, shows you that they're not arbitrary random numbers, but they're specific numbers that within only a very narrow range allow for the complex universe to result. And it gave you knowledge about a causal relationship between the specific numbers and the complex universe that results.
Once science discovered that, the question is now, how do we interpret that? What is the way to interpret that? These numbers are not just any old numbers, but they're specific numbers which in the future will result in the emergence of our ordered, structured, complex universe. And the idea is that
in the future, meaning from the Big Bang's perspective.
Yes, from the Big Bang. Yeah, exactly. Yes. Right. They're built in, they're baked into the universe. As far as we could tell, these are baked into the universe at its most from the very beginning. They're unchanging. They're called constants. But when you fast forward the universe from the beginning, from the Big Bang, we end up with everything which we see, all the structure, all the order, because these numbers are what they are. And if these numbers were different, then we would end up, all you would have is a sea of fundamental particles. You just have electrons and quarks and whatever, all banging around without anything structure, complex, no atoms, no molecules, no stars, no planets, no life, no anything. And how do you explain that? Is no longer reasonable to just say, forget about that. That's called fine-tuning. I think that these just happen to be the numbers which are built into the universe. But you're not explaining fine-tuning. You're just saying it could have been any number in the world, and it just happens to be the one set of numbers which results in our unbelievable universe. That's not a reasonable explanation anymore. The odds of that are just ridiculous. Physicists say that. That's unreasonable to say that we got that lucky, that the number happens to be that number.
Can I just add something?
Yeah.
And you can, again,
Yes.
Feel free to say that I'm not getting this correctly. I just want to make sure people understand. When you say the odds are against, you don't mean it's like it's 1 in 100. We're talking about numbers that are astronomically tiny. Maybe that's the wrong term. Yeah. It's microscopically tiny. Maybe you could give an example of the kind of number we're talking about in terms of chance alone.
Yeah, we just sort of listened to a video again today where it says the odds of getting it right are like 1 in a trillion, 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 trillion. Or like it's these odds.
Literally.
If every second, there's not enough particles in the universe to get the number of zeros on some of these numbers. That's sort of an entropy. It's a little bit of a different point.
It's astronomical.
Astronomical. It's right. Exactly. It's not the type of, and physicists acknowledges, they know that that's not a way to explain it, that we just happen to get lucky. Secondly, there's not reasonable to say, we're going to look for some law of nature, which is going to pop out those numbers. Maybe there's some law of physics that pops out these numbers. The idea is that a law of physics, that's the way scientists usually try to explain things. They try to see some prior law which results in these numbers. And if there were such a prior law, that would have nothing to do with the future result of fine-tuning. It would be a massive coincidence of the highest order to say there's some law that pops out numbers, it pops out one number, 1 over 137.035999, and that happens to be the number which is necessary to result in atoms and everything else. That's to hope to find such a law is like ignoring fine-tuning. You'd have to say it's a total coincidence that it's fine-tuned. And therefore, scientists and us realize that you can't just ignore fine-tuning. If you're trying to explain the cause of these numbers, if you're trying to solve Fine's mystery, how do you explain the cause of these numbers? You have to take into account the discovery of fine-tuning. And fine-tuning is agreed upon by atheists and theists alike. This is a universal discovery. Everyone appreciates the fact these numbers are fine-tuned. In other words, if the numbers were off by small percentages either way, you would not have a complex ordered structured universe as we know it. It would just be a sea of chaotic particles. Now, how do you interpret this discovery?
And that's where atheist scientists and theist scientists part ways.
Exactly.
Not in the fact that there is fine-tuning, but the way you understand what it means.
Right. Let me say one other thing that's important. So what we do differently on the Physics to God podcast, that's different from, like I said, like the way physicists present fine-tuning and the way Christian scholars present fine-tuning. First of all, we ground it in the mystery, which hopefully everybody understands if we did a good job explaining it now. But the second difference is that everybody says that fine-tuning is for life. Physicists say that, multiverse physicists, and religious people say fine-tuning is for life. And that's really, in a certain sense,
which means that the constants are fine-tuned to their values in order to produce life.
right. It's a big mistake when people make it present it like the exclusive purpose of fine-tuning of what is the purpose of these constants being within a certain range in order to have life. And it's not really true. It's what really is true is that if some of the constants were different, you wouldn't have atoms, you wouldn't have molecules. If other constants were different, you don't have any stars or you don't have any planets. Other constants are different, you don't get galaxies, you don't get a universe. And yeah, it's basically, man comes on the sixth day of creation. And if you don't have atoms, you're not going to get life. And if you don't have galaxies, you don't have life. You don't have planets or stars, you don't have life. So in a certain sense, life is dependent on everything else. So you can look at it as the purpose of fine-tuning is for life, but that's not quite true. You can't really prove that. What you could really show, and this is what everybody agrees to, is the facts are that the fine-tuning is for a complex universe in its totality. Religious people, and again, it's often Christian scholars, they want to say that it's fine-tuning for life because they're trying to show divine providence from this argument. That if God set the constants for this purpose in order to produce life, presumably human life, then you see God cares about us and God wants us to exist in particular. And that really shows there's providence specifically for mankind. Which again, we're not disagreeing with that in theory. We just don't think that this argument shows you that. You're grabbing too much and you lose the whole thing.
They're biting off more than they should be chewing.
Yes, yeah, exactly. It's exactly, you're going to lose it. And multiverse scientists, hopefully we have time to get to multiverse. They also, that's a tremendous irony. One of the great ironies of this is that multiverse scientists also have to say that the universe is fine-tuned for life because the way they explain these constants, you'll see necessitates saying that it's too much right now. You'll see later why they have to say it. But that's the irony. They both say it's for life, but that's not really what the argument shows.
So let's get into some of the points and where the theists and atheists differ. Let's talk first about how others who acknowledge that these numbers can't really be by chance. It doesn't make sense to say it's by chance, which I believe is the vast majority of physicists out there. And yet they don't believe in God. What do they say instead? And I believe here we can quickly get into the multiverse.
Okay, so let me do the other side first because it's much quicker. Okay.
Oh, okay.
So the natural interpretation that jumps out at everybody, okay, is that the constants have a purpose, and the idea of intelligence is to select out one particular value for the purpose of producing a certain objective. So the natural interpretation of fine-tuning is that there's an intelligent cause which selected these values for the constants in order to produce a complex universe with atoms, molecules, planets, stars, and life. That's the natural interpretation. That's what we argue for on our podcast. That's the argument for God and an intelligent cause of the universe.
And that's the mark of intelligence. The mark of intelligence is the person who could, from all the different sea of options out there, could select one which is perfect for bringing about their objective. That's what intelligence is. It comes from a Latin word, means to pick or to select. And that's the idea, is that the fact that as far as physics is concerned, these numbers could have been anything else, and they happen to be the specific values which are necessary to unfold to our complex universe, is a signature of intelligence. And that points to the fact that the cause is not some previous law, but is an intelligent cause who selected it for the purpose of bringing about our amazing complex universe.
Okay. Makes sense.
But multiverse scientists, they know God doesn't exist already. They already know that. So they say, well, how do they explain this remarkable coincidence of fine-tuning? So what they argue is that if there is a multiverse, which means that if there are an infinite number of other universes that we can't observe, and the constants have different values in every universe. So in our universe, it's 1 over, the fine structure constant is 1 over 137. But in a different universe, it's 1 over 150. And in the other universe, it's 14. So it's every single universe has a different values for all the different constants. And there's an infinite number of other universes, then every possible combination will exist. Now, it's true that 99.999% of these universes are completely filled with garbage. Essentially, there are no atoms, there are no molecules, no planets, no stars, no life, nothing, because the constants aren't fine-tuned appropriately. But there's going to be one universe, at least, and you'll see soon there's more, obviously, but one small percentage of that of those universes are going to have the constants that are properly fine-tuned. And those are the universes that are going to have atoms and molecules and planets and stars and life. And now you'll say, well, what are the odds that we happen to be in a universe that's fine-tuned? What about the vast majority of these universes are not fine-tuned? Why are we here? Well, obviously, an observer bias will explain that, because you couldn't possibly exist in one of these other universes. You can only exist in a universe that has fine-tuned constants, and therefore it's no question why you observe a fine-tuned universe, because you couldn't exist anywhere else. And that's basically how they try to explain fine-tuning.
Let me just summarize to make sure I understand properly. So fine-tuning presents these extraordinarily unlikely numbers. They're also ugly, but the way we can explain that is say, well, if you look at it teleologically in terms of their purpose, what they're leading towards, one would say, well, these are actually the perfect numbers, and any small change would actually make that not work. The perfect numbers to create a complex universe like the one that we live in. So you could either say that that was obviously chosen by something intelligent, which is what you're saying, or you could argue, on the other hand, that there are an infinite number of universes. Each one has a different set of values for the constants, which means one universe eventually, or frankly, if we're talking infinity, an infinite number of universes will have our values of the constants, but there are also an infinite number of universes that don't. And therefore, it's easier to explain this not by saying that there's an intelligent cause, but instead by saying that there are just an infinite number of universes, and we happen to be in the one, or one of the ones, that has the right values. Is that a correct summary?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Then you said, Aaron, before, because they already don't believe in God, therefore they go to this multiverse theory.
Right.
Nevertheless, it still seems to be somewhat surprising that so many physicists, in fact, usually the biggest names that many people have heard of in physics, all go in that direction and don't accept fine-tuning as indicative of an intelligent cause, regardless of what they may or may not have believed before studying physics. How do you explain that? How do you explain that so many brilliant physicists, Nobel Prize-winning physicists, don't want to say God exists? Now, obviously, you can't get into the brain of somebody else, but that has to be some sort of, so to speak, problem with your argument. Not that we have to believe in authority, but when many, many great physicists say, no, I don't buy that, we have to ask a little bit, why do they say that?
Right. So I think the reason, or one reason for this, is that, as Aaron said, physicists, scientists know that God doesn't exist. But what do they know? The idea of God, which they know is a childish idea of God, which they've been taught in school as a kid, or their parents, or who knows what. And they've encountered from religious people who don't present God in an intelligent way, in a thoughtful way. It just seems like God is like the tooth fairy and all the other fairy tales and whatever. And if they think that God doesn't explain anything, the idea of God, it's just another mystery, and you're not really explaining anything. There's all kinds of questions on God. Who designed God? Who fine-tuned God? What does God even mean? It doesn't do anything to just say God. So therefore, because they have in their mind God is just this make-believe thing, it doesn't do anything. Therefore, they know that can't possibly be the way to explain it. And therefore, well, I guess there must be infinitely many universes where the constants change. But we think that if it behooves us to, and this is what we're going to do in season 3, in our part 3. The first season, but just to digress 1 second, the first season we showed how this fine-tuning argument. The second we take up multiverse. In season 3, which we haven't done yet, we're going to show how the idea of Yichud Hashem, how if you formulate the idea, the Torah has an idea of God, of one God, of a simple God who doesn't have parts. And we could show how there is a way to formulate the idea of God in a cogent way, in a way that answers the questions of these atheistic scientists, which actually is satisfying to the human mind, that uses, then we're going to give examples from the categories of physics, of fundamentals, that the way to talk about God is something which is in line with the way to talk about fundamentals, even to physicists. And we're going to show that once you could formulate and express, understand what we could know about God, it really is an explanation, and we have to answer the questions of what fine-tuned God, what caused God, what do you even mean by God? And if you do so, which we think atheist scientists don't put any serious thought into theism, into ideas about God, then that's a live option. And not only that is it the live option, we're saying it's the compelling option, it's the indicated option. And in season 2 of our series, we show how multiverse doesn't work. Besides the fact that it just sounds ridiculous and it sounds make-believe, it actually doesn't even work in its own framework. And that's, we're not going to get into now, but multiverse, again, as wild as it sounds, we don't reject it because it sounds wild. We reject it because it actually doesn't end up working out. There's something called the measure problem, which we have to get to, but it doesn't work out even in its own framework. But that's a problem. But scientists, because God isn't an option for them, they have to do whatever they could to find something else because they know for sure that doesn't satisfy them.
Aaron, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just say is that it's not really getting like going into their head, Scott. Like they say that they tell you why they think what's amazing when you read their books, and it's like almost all of them when they read their books and they talk about fine tuning, they say that okay, now they always bring up God first. It's like they do acknowledge God in a paragraph or two, and then they just dismiss God as well. And they tell you why they dismiss God. Now they don't treat it seriously, but they say, "Well, who fine-tuned the fine-tuner?" It just begs the question to say God, or the idea of God is just God of the gaps, or it's just what caused God. They like Ali just mentioned, they tell you the questions that they have against God, and some of them are really serious questions that have to be addressed, which is again why we need part 3. I just want to address that one question because it could be some of your listeners have this, and this really shows the big difference is they say, who fine-tuned the fine-tuner? And most of them are thinking about an idea of God that's complex, that has parts, whether it's 3 parts, whether it's more than that, whether it's a big brain that they're imagining, a person in the sky, but they're imagining something complex. But the idea of Judaism, the idea of the God of Avraham Avinu as through our Masorah is Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, is the idea of one God with no parts. And the Rambam formulates it, he's one from all different aspects. He has no complexity. And the idea of who fine-tuned something is a legitimate question when something has parts and has complexity. Then who put together these 25 constants such that they should all work together in order to produce a universe with planets and stars and life? That's a good question. But if you get down to something that is absolutely simple, that has no complexity, that has no parts, it's not reasonable. God is not subject. The idea of Yichud Hashem, of one God, simple God, is not subject to the question of who designed God, who fine-tuned God. He doesn't have parts that are put together such that you can ask that question. And it's very, you don't ever really see these physicists speaking about philosophy in a very sophisticated way. They have a disdain for philosophy, for theology. They just know, because they've been brought up in a community, in a culture where theology and philosophy is stupid. They don't even do philosophy. Forget about theology. They just look down upon it. They're experts in physics, but they're not experts in philosophy. And they have a very childish notion of God, or they have a false notion of complexity, and therefore that notion really is false. It's avodah zarah, those ideas, and those notions should be dismissed. And if you dismiss God because you dismiss avodah zarah, then you really are left with the multiverse. There really is no alternative to, once you understand the problem deeply, like these physicists do understand the problem of fine-tuning. If you say God's impossible, then you really are left with the multiverse. There really is no alternative.
It's sort of like what one wag famously said, the God you don't believe in, I don't believe in either.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Isn't one explanation also possible to say that the idea of God, which is for most people theology, is simply not admissible? In other words, when I go to a doctor, if his answer to me is pray, that's usually not considered a good doctor. He doesn't have to deny that prayer works, but his job is to work with a different set of coordinates. So is it not wrong to say that scientists simply say God is not relevant to what we're trying to do? That's not an admissible hypothesis. I'm not going to say it's an unnecessary hypothesis. It's not an admissible hypothesis because we're talking about physical properties in the universe, and the God of Judaism transcends the universe. Accordingly, we have to go in the direction of multiverse or something like that, an equivalent, because otherwise you're breaking the rules of science.
Yeah, in some sense, they do say it's like a premise. This guy, at least Molin has, is like a premise is that the universe is all that exists. But it's one thing to say this is the rules of science, but that doesn't mean everything in the universe is science. It could be that there's something beyond science. And just because that's what science works with doesn't mean that you have a right to say, therefore, I know God doesn't exist because he's not in science. Yeah, maybe God created science. So it might be true those are the rules, but sometimes you have to be willing to question that. Maybe there's something beyond it. And maybe prayer is good. A doctor might say, I can't do anything, but prayer is a reality. And you have to be open to the fact that there's something beyond your discipline. Just because the discipline is limited to things which are in our universe, doesn't mean that's the be all and end all of everything.
We say over and over, this is a philosophical interpretation based upon accepted science. Before you start philosophizing about God, you got to get your facts right. So the facts are the scientific facts developed through the scientific methodology of experimentation and observation. And then what are the philosophical conclusions we can infer about the universe? Does the universe have a cause? Is that cause intelligent? How do you go about solving that question? It's an open question in philosophy. And the way you go about solving is by studying the universe, seeing the wisdom in the universe, understanding how the parts relate to other parts, how the laws relate to the resultant universe. And from that, a proper philosophical, logical, reasonable person will infer the existence of an intelligent cause. And yes, that's not strictly the scientific method, but it's proper philosophical thinking that you base upon a scientific facts that were discovered through the scientific method.
And let me just add one more idea, which I think you say as well, which is that once we're saying that you have to stay within science, in many ways, multiverse isn't particularly science either. It's also philosophy. It's also a theory of how our scientific rules came into being.
Right. It's the scientists certainly don't observe the infinite number of universes, and they don't have any tests for these. They don't test for it. They don't follow the scientific method in the multiverse theory to some degree, obviously. And like we discussed in the podcast, there's a real discussion going on amongst physicists of maybe they have to change the definition of science and the scientific method in order to accommodate the multiverse under the banner of science. So yes, the multiverse is not really science. A belief about infinite number of universes where all kinds of crazy things happen is I think even at just first glance to a regular person is something that itself is beyond the scientific method of our one universe.
And just to go back to come full circle, is to go back to the point about Dam al Hashval and the idea that there are atheistic scientists who are presenting arguments that God doesn't exist, and they say, "I can't believe you religious people. You believe in a God. You believe in an atheistic being. We can't see it. We can't do science with it." Well, the discovery of fine tuning has showed that there's really two ways to explain fine tuning. You could accept that we have one universe which is ordered and complex and beautiful, and that's the result of one God who designed and fine-tuned and ordered our universe, or you could posit the existence of infinitely many parallel universes, of which our ordered complex universe is but one coincidental outcome amongst the infinite. And to see that physicists, that scientists, that atheists are willing to embrace something as wild and crazy, outlandish as infinitely many parallel universes shows that fine-tuning is a real problem. And they can't take the high ground anymore and say, we only believe in things which we could see and test for. And you religious people are believing in things which are beyond that. They are the ones who are now believing in infinitely many of things which are beyond our ability to see and to test for. And on the contrary, we're believing where the evidence points to the existence of one cause which designed our one amazing universe.
I'll just add that from my own reading in popular science and seeing different physicists quoted, when it comes to religion and philosophy, I'm always struck by some of the shallowness of what they say. Obviously, I don't claim to have any idea of what they're talking about when it comes to the physics. I'm not going to pretend that I have expertise there. I'm not going to pretend I have expertise in philosophy either, but it's clear that there are, at least the ones I've read, are somewhat out of their league when they switch over to philosophy or theology. And I think there's some, maybe I should say for some of them, some arrogance because they're the physicists who are seen by some as the most brilliant members of our society. They can start opining in areas where they have no expertise. And that's my own experience, that their philosophical rigor is not that impressive.
Right. Yeah, they're brilliant, but they're not trained in philosophy. That's for sure.
And they say, there's a quote from Stephen Hawking who says, philosophy is dead. So it's like they don't engage in it because they think that it's dead and it's not something to be taken seriously. I think science is everything, and that it leads them to be shabby in philosophical reasoning.
One final question to ask both of you. If you want people listening to take home a message, aside from listening to the podcast Physics to God, what would you want them to leave this conversation with? What idea do you want them to take home? Aaron?
I want them to realize that it is a broader historical picture, but it's really for the past couple hundred years, there's been this attack against religion and God from science. And there is this sense among obviously atheists, secular atheists, but also amongst religious people that like you have to dichotomize your mind and that religion and God has to fall into one way of thinking. And then you have the science and rational thinking in another framework. And I think it's and in a certain sense, it's a defensive posture to do that and to say there's separate realms. That's, Gould's famous statement that there's, separate realms, magistra.
Non-overlapping magisteria,
something like that.
And Rabbi Sachs said something similar. He said that science tells you how it works and religion tells you what it means.
Right. And like just keep the realms separate and don't have one attack the other. But I just think is that's like a defensive posture because you think that they're antithetical, that you're afraid and you're scared of what physics and what science is going to point to. And I think times have changed. Last 25 years is the power of has really shifted in this philosophical discussion. And it's really shifted that physics and science really convincingly points to the existence of God. And in order to deny God, now you have to believe in a multiverse. And that no physicist 150 years ago, 25 years ago, they would never have believed in this multiverse. And the fact that they have to say something as wild as the multiverse shows you that that it has shifted. And I think it behooves a person to take a little bit of a risk and be willing to examine science in this framework that maybe could convincingly show me that God exists. And I don't have to be afraid that it's going to disprove God. That's not the case anymore. It never really was the case, but certainly things have changed.
Ellie?
Okay, I would like to make a point, is this idea that maybe science will be overturned and there will be a revolution and arguments. The point you mentioned earlier, Scott, is maybe we should be afraid. Who knows what's going to happen with science? And I'd like to point out that this argument, the argument from fine-tuning, is really an ancient argument which has existed in various forms throughout the ages. It's a type of a design argument. The Chovos Halevavos talks about an argument like this with like a water wheel, and he says if no one would ever say that a water wheel is created, it comes about by chance, and that the fact that all the more so the universe. And Chazal, the idea of even fine tuning, the idea of the constants, Chazal say that the name of Hashem, of Shin Daled Yod, Shakai, is Sha'omar La'olam Dai. He said to the world, enough. And Chazal, it's a Gemara in Chagiga, it talks about how the universe was like expanding like a warp of a wool, and God said, die, stop. Or the sea level was rising, and God said, die, enough. And he's Sha'omar La'olam Dai. And there's, I think, Sadigon and maybe a Barbanel, two of the say that the name Shakai means, it refers to the Pshat is Sha'omar La'olam Dai. He said to the world, enough. And I think the idea is that Chazal knew that obviously the science changes, but the fact that quantity is important for our universe, that if the sea level were higher, then things wouldn't work out, or anything in the universe, quantities matter, they make a difference. And if you look at our universe, you see that the quantities are just right for everything to exist. Now, of course, with modern science, where we realize the language of our universe is mathematics, we're able to see it in much more clarity about how important the numbers just are and how quantity is fixed, perfect. But the idea of that God is Omer La'olam Dai and the quantitative features of our universe point to God's existence is really an old idea, and it hasn't gone anywhere, and there's no reason to think that will be lost. While the particular form might change, it seems like this idea of a design argument, qualities, quantities, is something which has always been around, and it seems to be that it's pointing in the direction that it will continue to exist.
Okay, well, Aaron and Ellie, it has been a pleasure talking to you. I always enjoy learning from you, and this has been a lot of fun, and I appreciate you joining me today. Rabbi Dr. Ellie Fader, Rabbi Aaron Zimmer, I appreciate it.
Thank you, Scott. We appreciate it also.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, the Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.